to do a land. There we go. A land acknowledgement. So we'd like to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have had and continue to have a presence and a deep connection with the lands on and near the Oak Ridges Moraine, a part of what is known to the Indigenous peoples of North America as Turtle Island. These lands are the meeting place of two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and those of the First Nations of the Williams Treaties. We'd like to thank them and other Indigenous people for sharing this land with us. Indigenous people have been subjected to colonial oppression and injustice, which continues to this day. The Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust acknowledges that the first step to reconciliation is recognizing Indigenous peoples and their inherent rights to the land, which will ensure that we are creating a better future by strengthening our relationship with them and the land. Our land trust endeavors to honor the land and its treaties by ensuring healthy ecosystems that thrive forever and are protected forever. We recognize that working together with Indigenous peoples to include ecological traditional knowledge systems moves us towards an equitable and sustainable future. And I just want you to really think about that. I've been trained in, classic biology, and it just blows my mind that there's so much, we think science and everything's great, but there's so much amazing knowledge in the Indigenous culture that we need to recognize and also recognize the history, which has not been very great, and thank them. They're still sharing this land with us. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that where we are and how we're sharing that. So we'll just move forward, and hopefully everyone just has a second thought to appreciate the land that they're on from wherever they are all over the place. That this was once very important Indigenous land, and it still is, and we have to cherish it. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the Land Trust, so we're a charitable organization. We do ecological protection. How we do that is through land easement donations. So if you have a property that you own that you want to, don't want to see it turned into a parking lot one day or whatnot, you can place an easement on it that will hold. That protection is really cool because it stays with the deed of the land. So you can sell your land, you can give it to your kids. It's actually quite funny how many parents are like, I don't want my kids to do something to the land I love, so I want to protect it before my kids get it. But you can still protect your land, you can sell it, you can pass it on, you can move to a condo down in Florida where it's warmer and still know that that land that you've protected stays there forever. So that stays on the deed of the land. And it doesn't go with the owner, so it's permanent protection, and that's pretty good. So our slogan is protection beyond legislation, because as we're seeing up here is that sometimes legislation changes, and by having an independent charity hold that with support from the federal government at 2 levels, it really helps to strengthen that protection, and it's one of the, I think, probably the best you can get. So it's mandated protection through federal government. All right, so what we're doing right now, we're just about to increase these numbers. Stay tuned for a surprise in March. But right now we're protecting 5,073 acres across the moraine on 66 different properties. What this does, it helps with climate change resiliency. As I mentioned, like we just went from -34 to +6 in 2 days. That's local weather, but I'm sure you're starting to see changes. And so the more nature you can protect, the less nature that we lose, the more resiliency we have for those impacts from climate change. We help protect species at risk habitat. And that's also tied to something exciting we're about to announce. But that's really important. There's some amazing species at risk across the moraine, and we're really happy to be able to know that their homes on these protected properties will still be there. They're not going to be demolished. So that's really great. It protects biodiversity and our environmental heritage, which is very important to us as colonial settlers, and also to the Indigenous communities that were been here forever. So it's great, as I mentioned, and I'm probably saying it too often, is to be part of something that does this protection. It's really, really fun. So hopefully you guys can appreciate the land trusts, both ours and the ones that are right across North America, and you have a newfound wisdom on what they do and all the benefits that we get from them. Yes, so Pam's asking, is there a place we can go to get more information on land trusts? Yeah, if you're in Ontario, Pam, you can also send us a message. But if you're in Ontario, if you go to the OLTA, which is OntarioLandTrustAlliance.org, and you can pull up a map and find your local land trust. If you're on any other moraine, that would be us. If you're somewhere else, sorry, olta.org, yeah. They'll help you find it there. And if you have any problems, just give me a shout in the email, okay? So why we do it, help ecosystems, species at risk, future generations. Again, that forever forest, you know, old growth. Go to the next one. Okay, so here's some of the properties. You can see the moraine's a huge area. If you saw in the preamble, it's 160 kilometers wide. And it's a really significant, it feeds the water for both north and south. It feeds all the rivers. It's known as the rain barrel of Ontario because it's that porous silt that the glaciers left behind that helps capture and feed all the lakes that come out of there. So these little dots are some of the properties that we protect right across. So that's the, well, I don't know if you want to count, but it's the 66 properties is what it's supposed to represent. So we are moraine wide. Okay, so this is one exciting thing I can actually announce right now. We are joining this new Kirtland's Warbler Restoration Initiative. So the Kirtland's Warbler, it's a bit of a flagship for the whole initiative, but it was the most threatened songbird in North America. It was down to about 500 individuals, and down in the US, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, they did an amazing job at recovering this population. With that very specific habitat, which was lost because it was maintained by indigenous cultures and they used fire, and then colonial arrival happened and fire was bad and that was stopped, and a lot of that really important landscape was lost. So now we're trying to get it back on the landscape and the moraine, and with that, not only the Kirtland's warbler, it creates amazing habitat for them, but there's about 30 other species at risk that it will provide habitat for. So this is a really exciting new initiative. If you're a birder, you'll know what I mean by, oh my God, Kirtland's warblers, because they're so rare. So this is really exciting. And if you're interested in helping or volunteering, oh, someone's waving, someone's a birder out there. I'm not the only one. You can just give me an email there. Very exciting. And we'll have more news about that. And then if you just want to forward to the next slide, Serena. All right, we got a few upcoming events. Another webinar on bryophytes, which are mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. Not a nice name, but fascinating world. And then we have one on pollinators, which will be really exciting. So hopefully we'll see you at some of those. And if you want more information, oakridgesmoraine.org. Now, the reason why you're all here, not to hear my little preamble, but to hear Kim Beardracker Cabrera. I first, I guess, got to know who Kim was, but I didn't actually know her personally, was on the Animals Don't Cover Their Track Facebook website, or sorry, Facebook page. And it's an amazing one. The admins, Kim started it, and the admins, she has people helping her. They're really good at keeping the dialogue just about learning. No, you know, smart comments or arguments. It's, you have to learn. If you're going to identify a track, you have to explain what it is. If you want to learn like more education, that's the place to go. I think a lot of the tracking I've learned is from just following that website. It's fantastic. So Kim is a cyber tracker and sign specialist certified, level 2 trailing certified. And I think she might give a little bit more explanation on what that is. She had the first website in 1997 on tracking, so great. And she teaches tracking all through her native California. And through that group, the Animals Don't Cover Their Tracks, basically across the world now, Kim, because I see posts from like Africa and India, all over the place. So you're really gone international, haven't you? And so that's why we brought her virtually up to Ontario today. So there's some links there, and we will send out a follow-up email with this so that if you missed anything, we'll have all those resources on there. So the Facebook group is called Animals Don't Cover Their Tracks. Is that right, Kim?
Yes, I put the name in the chat also.
Awesome, thank you. And I highly recommend it. So without further ado, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. We're now at 320 people. This is great. I will pass it over to Kim to share her amazing knowledge with us. All right, take it away, Kim.
Okay. Get my screen sharing up here. Can everybody see that? Okay. So greetings from Northwestern California. I'm up here in the Redwood country, And my name is Kim Cabrera. I'm a tracker of wildlife, and hopefully you're here for the wildlife tracking talk today. I wanted to talk about a little more advanced tracking skills than what we talked about the last time, about a year ago. I had one of these where we did a very introductory tracking talk and talked about how to identify various tracks and signs, and didn't go into a whole lot of detail on some of the other types of clues to wildlife presence. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today is, there. Well, for some reason, the slide didn't want to advance. What I wanted to talk about today is more advanced tracking skills. So to me, advanced tracking is more about looking at other clues to presence of animals. So when you get into really higher levels of tracking, what you start doing is you start practicing trailing. And with trailing, the idea is to catch up to and be able to see the animal before it can see you. And so in order to do that, it requires a lot of knowledge about the wildlife, their habits, the places that they live, the places that they seek out food and shelter and water. So you have to really have a good background in the knowledge of the biology of that animal and its behavior. And a lot of the behavioral clues that animals live, or that animals leave, can be seen on the landscape. So that's kind of the difference that I'm getting at here. A footprint is a track. So we've all seen those on the ground, and that's one clue to animal presence, but animals leave lots of other clues. So you might find a feather. You could find a discarded snail shell, or a feeding sign, or some sort of a scent marking sign. And a lot of those types of clues are pretty easy to misinterpret, and sometimes they're pretty straightforward because there's only certain species that can do them. But there's other ones that the behavior overlaps between several species, and so it's helpful to have some knowledge of tracks and signs. And so what I wanted to do today is talk about some of these signs and the clues that those leave on the landscape that'll help you to interpret the behavior of those animals, what they were doing, and what animal it was that left that sign. So a lot of animals will leave signs on the landscape, and a lot of times those signs are invisible to us because we don't have the sensory organs or the ability to sense some of these things. So what this little gray fox is doing right here in the video is it's scent marking. It's using the glands on its cheeks to rub on this log on the ground, and it's rubbing on the ground. And those glands are depositing scent from oils in them. And these animals do a lot of scent marking, but that sort of thing is something that humans can't detect visually. And our noses tend to not be strong enough to pick up these subtle scents. But animals like this skunk, which is responding to the scent marking of the fox, and then the fox is again responding to the other fox's marks. So that kind of stuff is not visible to us, but there are other clues that are visible. So even though many animals are nocturnal and we don't get to see them in action, we can examine the signs that they leave in the forest, and it'll help us to decide what animal's been there, what it was doing, and it helps us to learn about the behavior of those animals. So I wanted to start out with a big species that makes a lot of sign on the landscape. So black bears are one of the largest animals in most of the habitats where they live, and they leave copious amounts of sign behind. There's different activities that they do in the forest that leave behind this sign, and I'm sure you've all seen the Baloo the bear in the Jungle Book movie, where he goes up and rubs his back on a tree and scratches his back with a tree, and most bears out in the woods don't pick them up like Baloo did and use them as back scratchers, but they do leave markings on trees, and they come up to the tree and they place their back against the tree. They stand on their hind feet and they rub their back against the bark of the tree, and then they'll turn around and over their shoulder they'll bite into the bark, and they'll also take their claws and grab the bark and rake forward with their claws to leave these marks. So what you see on the tree over here on the right is those sort of markings. for some reason I can't get the menu up here to annotate, but see these claw marks that go horizontally. I'm kind of drawing on the screen here a little bit so you can see. Those are claw marks. And that's from where the bear grabbed the bark behind its head and raked its claws forward. As opposed to over here on this tree on the left, you can see where some of this was literally pulled away. Some of this whole section right here of the bark was pulled away. And bears will bite trees, and they will bite them over their shoulder, but they'll also face the tree and bite into the bark and rip out sections of the bark. So when you're looking at these signs, the longer marks tend to be the claw marks. And then there are some marks that are horizontal that have, they meet in the middle, and there may be a little bit of bark left or not, but those are usually the tooth marks. So you can see both tooth marks and claw marks in the bark of trees. When bears do this, it's a visual marker to other bears. So other bears come along and they notice it visually, and they also can pick up the scent from these things, because bears have a sense of smell that's hundreds of times more sensitive than that of a dog. So when a bear comes upon the marks of another bear, it recognizes those. Oops. And when they do that rubbing of their back on the tree, a lot of times fur will get snagged in the bark of the tree. And so as a tracker, you can come up there and look very closely. Now notice the scale on this one in the lower right is millimeters, or excuse me, centimeters. So you can see how small these things are, and you really have to look for them. And where I found this was on a fallen tree across a trail, and the bears had been going under this fallen tree, but as they did that, this little broken branch was sticking down, and so they were rubbing their backs on it, and the fur was being transferred off. And the one on the left was, of course, from where the bears stepped up to the tree, turned around with its back to the tree, and just started rubbing. And a lot of fur gets pulled off. Some of these trees have more rough bark, and it's more difficult for the fur to show up. So you have to walk up to the tree and sometimes look at it super close, because some of these pieces of fur, they're only a couple inches long, or centimeters wise, like 3 centimeters, 4 centimeters, and up. So they can be a lot larger. But this is another behavior that not only leaves scent, but it also helps the bear to remove the old coat. So they have a very thick coat in the wintertime to keep them warm. A lot of more under fur grows in the wintertime. And in the summertime, with the warmer weather, that under fur begins to shed. And so they want to get that off too. And you'll see bears looking pretty shaggy in the spring when they start to lose that winter coat and get their summer coat, because they're shedding some of that excess under fur. And this is where some of it ends up. So some of it is incidental, like the thorns on the left. Those were just incidental on a trail where bears had been passing back and forth, and the thorns just happened to catch the bears and catch some of the fur. And so there were a few of the little the vines that showed bear fur. On the right there, you can see what an individual piece of fur looks like when it's snagged on a tree. This required looking closely. And one thing I wanted to point out on this particular image is that the bear has been using this tree for rubbing its back a lot, because this jagged edge of the bark here isn't very sharp. You notice how it's rounded off, and even these edges here are rounded off like they've been polished. And that's because they have been polished. They've been polished by the bear and its fur rubbing against that, just like a little bit of very fine sandpaper, only it's bear fur. So on some of these trees, they'll use them for generations, and you will end up being able to look at the bark of the tree itself to see the signs that the bears have been using it. Oops. So in this video, I want to show you one of the behaviors, or a couple of the behaviors, one of them that I've talked about and one of them that I'm going to show you in a minute. But watch how this bear walks with a stiff-legged gait. See how his hind feet are very stiff-legged? That's going to come up in a minute when I show you a particular sign. But this is what it looks like when the bears are rubbing their backs on the trees. And then they create a trail near those trees. So this male bear is very carefully stepping where his feet stepped last time, and he's using that stiff-legged gait. So the stiff-legged gait is allowing him to grind his feet, the paw pads of his feet, into the ground. And there are scent glands on the bottom of those feet. And so every time he grinds the bottom of the foot on the ground, it leaves more scent behind for another bear to find. And you will literally find, if you have a trail camera on a tree like this, you'll see other bears literally following the footsteps of this bear and sniffing at him. Now, what he's doing right now is that behavior where I told you they bite the bark, and he's biting sections out of there. And not only did he use his claws to pull some of that bark, but he turned around and he bit it. So now you can see up on the tree the actual mark up here where he was biting it. And that mark is going to stay there. It's actually been there for years. This is an older video. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to stop the video there. There it goes. So they will rub on with their backs. They will also rub with their sides. So you'll see a bear come up to a tree and just rub his side a little bit. So it seems from a human perspective, it seems like there's some itch relief or relief thing going on there for the bear. And watch his gait here. They will use these trails over and over. And each time, notice how his feet are going right in those same holes where he's been stepping. Whoops. There we go. Okay. And over time, what that does is that repeated stomping creates one of these trails. And what you can see is that over time, these individual footsteps have been worn into the ground, into the grass here. And you can just follow this out one by one, where the bear's been walking. And so as you saw that bear do, they use that stiff-legged gait and they really stomp heavily with their feet to get the scent in there. And eventually, if they use this over years and years and years, the trails could end up with just two parallel rows of just like depressions in the soil from so many bears going over them. And this is an activity that is shared by all the bears in the area. So it's not just one male bear that's doing this. A whole bunch of bears will use these trails and they'll just stomp in the same footsteps each time they go back over this trail. And it's trackers call them stomp trails or ritual marking trails, because the bear will walk over it, turn around, walk back over it, turn back around, walk over it again, and they'll just do that repeatedly, going back and forth. And it's a very deliberate thing that they're doing to wear this trail into the ground. So this is a visual marker for other bears, but it's also olfactory because of the scent glands on the feet that deposit scent in these. So another thing that bears do when they're marking, and this is kind of interesting, they decapitate saplings. So there's one tracker that named this a whammy tree, because bears will come up and they will literally just start smacking the tree and grabbing it, pulling it down. They'll bite on it, and they're just really destructive to these little saplings. And they're really small, 2 inches, 3 or 4 centimeters wide. Saplings, not very big, but bears have this thing where they really like to beat up on those poor little saplings, and they'll literally decapitate the sapling as a marking thing. And this is very common along their regularly used trails. It's also common sometimes along dirt roads. In bear country, you'll find little saplings that have just been marked randomly along dirt roads. And the other thing with bears is they do have a playful nature. So I've actually, got a lot of trail camera videos, but I've seen bears on trail camera just walking along the trail, suddenly reach up and just smack a branch or just pull it down and let it go. And it seems more like a play behavior than anything else. And that's what happened on this one on the right here, is the bear just reached up and clawed a branch that was hanging at an angle over a trail, and he just literally just smacked it and walked on, and that was it. Just left this mark, and you can see all 5 of the marks from the claws there, because they have 5 toes on their front and hind feet. And this was just, to me, that was a play behavior. So some of the things that we're seeing here are behaviors that you're able to read in the sign on the landscape. And that's what makes this more advanced tracking, because instead of looking at footprints, we're looking at signs and clues that the animals are leaving on the landscape other than tracks. So bears also, and I'm focusing on bears first because they make the most copious amount of sign. They will come along, and especially in the springtime when they find a really good food source nearby, they'll make beds. They're out of their den, they're out being active and looking for food. It's early in the spring, and they still need a place to rest, but they don't want to go retire into a den, which could be a hollow tree, could be a hollow under a rock or a log. But they want a place where they can sleep, and they make themselves comfortable. So what they do is they'll find branches, and in this case, this tree, this happens to be a redwood tree, but it's very similar with the bark of a cedar tree. And notice the shredded appearance of this bark here. So this is not the normal appearance of this bark. If you look up here where this is untouched, this is more of the normal appearance right here. And this stuff has just been shredded. And so what the bears do is they claw this and just rake their claws down it to get the material loose from the tree. And it ends up at the base of the tree. And then what they do is they sort of make this little hollow in it. See this hollow right here? And see this hollow right over here? This is where the bear sleeps. So that's the actual bed, is that little round depression. And what they've done is take this bark to make a mattress. And then they lay on it. And when they're laying on it, it compacts it down. But it keeps it a little more comfortable for them rather than just laying on sticks and rocks and things like that. I've also found places where they'll strip off small branches from a tree. So like a Douglas fir tree with the very flimsy, very soft sort of tips of the branches. They'll rake that off of a tree too, and then rake it together into like a debris pile, and then they'll lay down on it to sleep. So you'll know that you found a bear bed. A couple of clues that help you to tell is, number one, they're near a large tree. So there's usually a big tree near it, especially if it's a mom with cubs, because they use these trees. Some trackers call these babysitter trees, because if the mom leaves the cubs there and there's something scares them, they can run up this tree. They can climb up there and get into high branches and find safety up there if a predator approaches from the ground level. And so there's always a babysitter tree nearby. And it will be at the base of a large tree, like in this case, it's a Douglas fir. And with frequent use, what happens is the bears they'll wake up in the morning, yawn, stretch, get up, and then they'll defecate right near their bed. And so the bear beds become ringed with large piles of scats with more use. So the longer the bear has been using this bed, the more scat piles you'll find around it and in the general vicinity. So not only can you tell that the bear has been using this as a resting site, you can also tell somewhat the length of time. You can use that as a rough estimate of the length of time a bear's been using it. So let's talk about another large animal that makes very obvious markings on the landscape that are done for purposes of scent. So deer, white-tailed deer, black-tailed deer, mule deer, and others, elk, they have glands right at the corners of their eyes, and it's called a preorbital gland because it's right in front of the orbital part of the eye, the orbital bone. And this gland produces scent. And in the bucks, they are using this gland to distribute scent not only on trees and shrubs, but also on their antlers. So I'm sure most of us have seen, if you've been out in the woods, you've probably seen trees like this that have been kind of shredded. And this sign is very frequently confused with that of the bears. Remember, we saw where the bear had raked the bark to obtain nesting material for its bed, and also where the bear was raking the bark with its claws. The other thing bears do on trees that leave sign like that is climbing trees. But usually when bears mark on trees, they don't show this kind of shredded appearance where there's sort of an up and down shredding. So down here, you've got peels that are curling off and shredding in this direction. And then up here, you have these peels that are curled off. So up and down on this tree, there's a lot of shredded bark, and the bark in the center has been removed, but there's none of it down here at the base. And this is a very small sapling. So this is 2 inches or about 5 centimeters right there in width. So it's not a very big one. It's not something that a black bear would have used as a bedding site. And it's most likely not one that it would have used to create a mattress. So this was created by a deer, a buck, rubbing its antlers up and down on the trunk of this tree. And they do that, those glands excrete scent. So most of us have sebaceous glands and scent glands that secrete scent. So I'm reminded of humans in our sweat. Essentially, animals have glands just like that. And so when the buck rubs that preorbital gland on the sapling, it gets some of that scent on there, and then it can be transferred onto his antlers when he rubs the antlers on this tree. So it's a way of distributing his scent onto his antlers and onto the landscape. And there's some theories that when the buck walks through the forest after that, that the scent sort of wafts off his antlers, and other animals can detect that smell and know that the buck is in the area. Another thing that will differentiate these types of markings from those of bears is that you have these up and down sort of gouge marks in the bark of this tree. So it shows up better on this larger tree, but there's gouge marks here. And these were made by antlers being rubbed up and down on this tree. And you can see the directional nature of these. And at the base of the tree, there's sort of a pile of sawdust because this was a little bit harder type of bark. And so as the buck was rubbing its antlers up and down, it also used those tines, and the tines of the antlers gouged into the bark. So that's why this can be very easily confused with bear sign, but look for the shredding, particularly at the top and the bottom of the marks. You can see where the bark has been shredded. Right here is pretty clear, and down here it looks pretty shredded. So that's the sort of thing to look for to tell these from bear markings, and also the height. So deer are not going to mark very high up on a tree, whereas when that bear was marking, he was standing on his hind feet and marking at almost 6 feet up the tree. So the deer aren't going to be able to reach that high. This is usually done lower on the trunks of trees for the deer. And so that's another way that you can tell this was not made by a bear. Okay, so here's another behavior that deer exhibit during the mating season. And this was kind of interesting because this one showed up in the tracks. And when I found this, I was like, what was it doing? And it took a minute to puzzle this out. But the bucks have a particular behavior where they rub the tarsal glands together. So tarsal glands are the glands that are on the heels. So their back legs, you know how their back legs come up and then have a little bend in them. The tarsal glands are right there at the heel. And so they'll crouch down and they'll rub those tarsal glands together to get the scent going, and then they'll urinate on it. And that washes some of that scent down and it ends up on the ground. So right here, what you're seeing is this is the urine spot, and it's at the back of these tracks. And notice how all of these tracks are kind of bunched up together. So here's an individual footprint right here. This is one hoof, and there's a hoof right here. These are all bunched up together because the buck was standing in a particular posture, and I'm going to show you that posture in a minute. But this particular set of tracks indicates that behavior, and it's called rub urinating because they're rubbing the tarsal glands together and then they're urinating on them. And this is done by male deer. This is the posture that they exhibit when they do that. So notice how his glands, which are located on the inside of the heel right here, those glands are together, and he's rubbed them together, and then his feet are bunched up. So this hind track, I wish you could see the feet more clearly, but notice how those feet are bunched together right there. And the position of where the urine would splash is exactly where we saw it in that set of tracks. So this buck is exhibiting that posture, and this is something that they do during the rutting season, which is usually in the fall for most deer. So deer, elk, white-tailed deer, black-tailed deer, and mule deer usually do this. Okay, and white-tailed deer are also known for making scrapes. So we don't see this kind of thing as much with mule deer in the West, but white-tailed deer, the bucks will make a scrape. And elk are also known to do this. So what they do is they take their feet and they scrape the soil down to the bare earth. A lot of times there's a branch overhanging this up above, and they'll be rubbing on rub their antlers and their facial glands on the overhanging branch at the same time as they're rubbing their feet and urinating in this sort of pit that they've created by clearing the ground with their feet. Now their hooves have another gland. In between the hoofs, there's a gland. So this gland is rubbed on the ground when they're doing that digging motion and kicking at the soil to create these scrapes. And so the scent from that gland, as well as from where the buck urinates in this little pit, the scrape, is transferred there. And this is another thing that they do during rutting season, which is for most deer is in the fall. Another kind of fun thing to find is where the bucks take their antlers and just sort of thrash on the vegetation with them. And I don't know how common this is in white-tailed deer. Mule deer and black-tailed deer do this, and elk do this also. So as a tracker, you'll be walking along and you might find some broken branches laying on the ground and with fresh breaks on them. And they could be very far from where the original plant was that they came from. And that's because when the bucks do this, a lot of times the vegetation gets caught in the antlers, and then they walk off and the stuff falls off their antlers. But what you're seeing on these two shrubs here is how the bark has been damaged here. There are breaks, there are pieces that have fallen off, like this one here that's completely separated from the plant, and the rubbing here on the bark. So this is all due to a buck doing what we call thrashing the vegetation with his antlers. And this is an auditory signal, because when they're thrashing with their antlers, other nearby deer can look over and say, oh, hey, there's a big buck. He's a big guy. He's thrashing that brush with his antlers, So it's kind of an impressive thing to other deer. And it also does the same thing about transferring the scent, like we talked about with when they're rubbing their glands. Let's watch a buck actually doing this. So this guy, sorry, it's black and white, but the guy on the right there, it's what it looks like when they thrash their antlers on something. The shrub actually did survive, but you can see how he's getting his antlers in there, and you can see how things would easily break off or easily become attached to his antlers. And then as he walks off, pieces of it could fall off. Usually the plants do survive that behavior. So that's what it looks like when he's thrashing his antlers. Okay, I'm going to transition to some of the more smaller or mid-sized mammals that leave clues on the landscape. And beavers are one of them. Now, beavers make the obvious signs that we're all used to seeing, like where they chew down trees and leave tooth marks, and where they build dams. Those are pretty obvious. But scent mounds are not as obvious to us as humans, because we don't think of scent as being our primary way of detecting our environment around us, whereas some other animals use scent very frequently. So what beavers do is they'll go down to the bottom of the pond and bring up some mud and vegetation, and they'll pile it up on the bank of the creek or on the bank of the pond. And then they'll deposit what's called castoreum on it, which is their scent from their scent glands. So most mammals have scent glands, have a variety of scent glands. You know, it's the most famous one, of course, being skunks with the anal glands that spray their scent. But beavers, otters, deer, most mammals have scent glands that they use in one way or another. And a lot of this communication that goes on among mammals is invisible to us as humans unless we can see these physical signs. So beavers making scent mounds. This is another way of communicating amongst themselves. And beavers are a little more territorial than most other rodents. They will run off interlopers, chase them off. So a scent mound, if another beaver was to mark on top of this beaver scent mound, it would lead to conflict among them. So these are very important in communication, not only within species, but interspecies. And we'll see that in a little while. We'll see some interspecies communication using scent. So how about otters? Let's I want to show some behaviors that these guys are doing here. So otters will do what this one's doing here, and they'll rub on the ground. They'll roll. They will also, like this one right here, is grabbing some of the leaves there and sort of bringing them backwards into a pile to make a mound. And sometimes they'll do this where they make big piles out of those leaves. This one's not making a really big one, but they'll bring the leaves back into a pile and then they'll scent on top of it. And they'll do what this one's doing, which we call the scat dance. And notice how he bobbed his rear end up and down. I'll go back so you can see that again. This is called the scat dance. Bob the rear end up and down and then deposits a scat. So the behavior that you saw there with the rolling in the vegetation or just on the ground is one scent marking thing. The scat dance is another, and making those mounds like this one's doing here with drawing those leaves into a mound. There we go. Okay. So one of the things that otters will deposit when they're doing this scent marking is called otter jelly. And this is just an informal name for it. I really don't know if there's actually a formal name for it, but it's sort of this gelled, yellowish, greenish kind of secretion that comes from the intestines of the otters. And if you find one of these, you know right away because it smells very strongly of fish. Otters eat a lot of fish, and it comes out, you know, in their scats, but also in this otter jelly stuff. And so this is something that you'll find when otters come out of the water at a place called a haul out, which is a regularly used location. And oftentimes it's on the edge of a river or on a little peninsula that sticks out into a waterway. They'll use those. They'll use logs. They'll use anything pretty much that's raised up above ground level, rocks, things like that. Otters will use to mark on. And sometimes you'll find jelly like this, or you'll find scats. So this stuff has a very powerful scent. If you ever run across it, you'll know. In those regularly used areas, which we call a haul out, where they come out and they'll deposit scats and they'll do those behaviors like you saw in the video. A lot of times, if they've been using it very frequently, the vegetation, and in this case, you know, the mosses, will begin to turn brown. And that's because when the otters use this location, they've been urinating there. And that's enough to create this sort of brownout of the vegetation. And you can see some remains of a scat over here. Whoops. Remains of a scat over here next to that, where the otter had previously deposited a scat. Their activity of rolling in the sand serves several purposes. So they have oil glands also that they need to distribute the oils to help waterproof their fur. And so when they come out onto these sandy banks and start rolling in the sand, one of the things they're doing is distributing that oil across their fur, and it helps to maintain their ability to stay waterproof and warm if they're under the water, because they spend a lot of time hunting underwater. So as a mammal, it's important for them to maintain that temperature control. So you will see otters coming out and sunning themselves on banks. You'll see them doing a lot of rolling around and things like that, that are kind of odd looking to us as humans, but it's really serving a purpose for them. So otters also create latrines, which are large accumulations of scat left by many animals over time. And so on the left there, you see just an embankment that was raised above the river level. And there's probably 15, 20 scats in there from various otters over various times. And this is right above the water level. The otters were able to just slide right back into the water from there. It was less than 2 feet. They could just drop back into a deep pool. And so this is what's called a haul out or an otter latrine. They come out to that area, and if a new otter's passing through, they will pick up the scent of this and they'll come out and investigate and leave some of their own. So it's sort of like the otter's post office, where they're communicating with each other. Hey, I'm here, I'm in the neighborhood, and left a scat so that you'd know I was here. And remember I said that they also like to use raised objects. So this one on the right here was a chunk of concrete or rock or something that was in the middle of the river, and on it you've got just numerous scats of different ages on here. And so it's being in the middle of the river. The otters would haul out on this thing and leave a scat, sit there and maybe dry off in the sun, and then move on in their journeys. But this is the kind of places, if you're a tracker, to look for this sort of thing. So look on raised objects, look between water bodies, look on peninsulas of land that stick out into a water body. If you're looking for this kind of sign, those are the places to go look for it, because that's traditionally where otters tend to leave this kind of sign. And again, these latrines also often very strongly smell of fish, which is one of the rare times that our human noses could actually pick up some of the scent communication that goes on between these animals. Excuse me. So this was one where we actually saw the otter come out and do these behaviors. On the left there's a scat right here, made out of crayfish parts. There's the urine mark right by it. There's a bunch of tracks here. You can see all the tracks here. And then there was a little sliding and rolling over here in the sand. And all of this was part of the communications that the otter was doing at that site. The ones that you saw in the video, this is the type of sign that it leaves on the landscape. So you may find the scats being the most visible thing. The tracks and the marks from the rolling are going to eventually wear away. The scats will stay around longer. The scent is kind of variable. It's easier to detect it when it's fresh, as far as being a tracker going out looking for this kind of thing. But if you find one of these that's super fresh, and this one was only less than minutes old, you'll be able to see all of the clues there that tell you that this was what the otter was doing. This was the behavior it was exhibiting there. So otters aren't the only one that create latrines. Raccoons are also known for this. And raccoon latrines are oftentimes, they're going to be near where they have a good food source. So a place where they find a lot of shellfish and things that they're hunting. You might find a latrine near there. You might find a latrine in the branches of a tree, because that's another place that they tend to make these. And that's one of the things, like if you're following these guys as a tracker, don't go climbing trees without watching where you're putting your hands first. Because in raccoon country, you can put your hand in one of these latrines accidentally. They will also create them sometimes at the bases of trees. So raccoons, if they are roosting, if they have a little a place where they're resting in a tree. Sometimes they use tree hollows. And if they're climbing up that tree frequently like that, they may create a latrine at the base of that tree. They also will leave them underneath people's houses and basements, things like that. So if you have, maybe they're getting into pet food somewhere in the neighborhood and they are developing a latrine nearby. One thing to be aware of with raccoons is that their scats can have raccoon roundworm. And there is a lot of information about this on the CDC website. If you wanted to check that out, I have a little thing at the end of this presentation, a brief sort of life cycle of the raccoon roundworm, but it can infect humans, and that's why it's a concern. So if you do identify a raccoon latrine and you want to clean it up, there are some procedures or some protective measures you should take to protect yourself so that you don't expose yourself to the raccoon roundworm. But as far as a behavioral thing, raccoons and otters both create these latrines, and otter scats can look very similar to raccoon scats because of the overlap in diet. So they eat a lot of crayfish. Raccoons eat a lot of crayfish. Otters tend to catch more actual fish than the raccoons do because raccoons don't go diving in the water to get to their food. But the shellfish kind of diet overlaps between the two species. So that can create a little bit of confusion as far as their latrines go. So what we've been talking about is the interspecies interactions, and I wanted to show you. So this is an interesting thing. So the fox just scent marked here, and we're going to see several species respond to this scent mark and create scent marks of their own in response. So a family of 3 mountain lions came along. Sorry about the glitchy video. I don't know what happened there. But they investigated the mark left by the fox. You can see that they're sniffing at it. They're curious about it. And the one on the right here is starting to crouch down because it's going to make a deposit of its own. Notice the position of the mouth of this one that's sniffing at it now. When she brings her nose up, you can see that the mouth was open. And that's a response called phlegmen, F-L-E-H-M-E-N. And cats exhibit that when they're sniffing different scents. It's a way of getting the scent on the vomeral nasal organ that is right behind their front teeth. This cat's going to show it too. Watch for the open mouth expression of this bobcat. And that's it's also called the Jacobson's organ. And it's right above their front teeth. And when they keep their mouth open like that, it's supposed to allow more of the scent to get on that organ. And so it's called phlegmen, is the response that he or she has got here. And you'll notice when the head comes up, the mouth will be slightly open. You can also see this on domestic cats. If you have cats at home, oftentimes when they sniff each other's scats or interesting smells, they'll do that too. You'll see them with their little mouths just partially open. And yeah, like humans doing wine tasting, exactly. So that was an interesting sequence of interspecies interactions with one scat deposited over there by the cougar. Whoops. So a lot of these behaviors that I've talked about tonight are related to scent marking or to the mating season of these animals. And a lot of them have visual clues that a tracker could find. I'm trying to get this to advance. There we go. Okay. So what that gray fox was doing there was interesting because they have a behavior called overmarking, and other canines do this as well. Your coyotes, your gray foxes, and red foxes, they're very interested in doing this behavior for some reason. So the fox will come along and place one of its scats on top of the scat of another carnivore. In this case, a black bear. And this one also is an old black bear scat with a little fox scat right on top of it. So this is called overmarking. And so the fox, being the smallest, littlest carnivore in this ecosystem, is saying, hey, I'm a big tough guy. I'm going to mark over your scat, Mr. Bear. I'm the big guy around here. And, you know, it's a way of foxes trying to be tough because, you know, they're so small and they're not much bigger than a domestic cat. They're prey for other animals and they probably feel pretty vulnerable. So this overmarking thing is kind of the fox saying, well, I'm the big guy around here. And they do it to bobcats, scats too. They do it on coyotes, scats. So if you see a lot of little scats on top of a bigger predator scat, it might be the gray fox. So on the left here, you have an actual latrine. And remember, the raccoons created them and the otters created them. And in this case, this is a fox latrine. There seems to have been one bobcat in here. And whether that was on top of or not, I can't tell at this point, but I think that may have been what started the fox making this latrine. Foxes frequently use logs as travel routes throughout their environment. A lot of times it's quieter to travel on top of a log than on top of dry leaves. And so foxes will just trot along on top of logs, and they very frequently mark scent and scat on top of logs. So if you're looking for signs of this animal, look on top of logs. And you'll also find that these latrines develop over weeks or months. So one fox will deposit a scat there and another one will come along and deposit its scat on top, et cetera, and they just follow each other doing that. On the right, there's a bobcat scat. So the bobcat scat was probably there first. And then this broken up scat made out of manzanita berries here, this is the gray fox scat. It was deposited as an overmarking attempt on top of that bobcat scat. So it's very common for foxes to try to do this behavior. There's an interesting study called "The Scent of My Enemy is My Friend." And it's by Max Allen, who's a scientist that studies carnivores. And he found that gray foxes were coming along and they were rolling in the scats of other predators. And the theory was that they were acquiring the scent of that predator in order to smell tougher, you know, like smell like they're a bigger animal. And so when they're walking through the forest, you know, the other animals are like, I smell the coyote coming, I better get out of the way, you know. So the foxes were sort of wearing that scent as kind of an armor in a way. So I wanted to talk about a very subtle a very subtle behavior that is also scent marking related, and that is making scrapes. So scrapes are made by canines and they're made by felines. In this case, the mountain lion was scraping on the ground, and notice how this was done. I'm going to back this up a little bit. Just the hind feet. They're paired and they're making short scrapes there. His feet are just making movements of about 6 to 8 inches, just making a couple of little scrapes on the ground. And that's the mountain lion's scrape. So it's not a huge wild scrape with claw marks everywhere like you find with canines. If you have a domestic dog, you've probably seen them doing this. After they defecate, a lot of times they'll just scratch the ground with their legs and kick out and just kick stuff everywhere. It's pretty uncontrolled. But with these mountain lions, it's very short scrapes, very controlled. And this is what it looks like. So what you end up with is just these very short parallel scrapes. And the width of a mountain lion's paw is up to 4 inches or so. So these will be approximately 4 inches across if you were to measure it. Bobcats make scrapes also, but their paws usually get only about 2 inches wide. So they'll be similar in appearance, but correspondingly narrower because of their smaller feet. So they're not a very obvious mark on the landscape. They're really subtle. I mean, you could walk right by this thing and not even see it or not know what it is, because they don't always deposit scats on them. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they'll make the scrape and then deposit a scat on it. So usually if they were going to do it, the end where the debris was kicked up would be where you'd find the scat. It would be in there. But they don't always put scats. And there's another very common belief that the cats always cover their scats, and that's not true. They sometimes will cover their scats, but often they'll just make a scrape and deposit a scat on top of it and leave it unburied. It's way more common for a domestic cat to bury their scats even when they're walking around out in wilder areas than it is for some of these wild felines to bury their scats. So these very subtle marks were made by a large animal, and it's very easy to pass these by and not even know that they're there. It seems that they like certain kinds of substrate. So the one that you saw in the video was on an old rotting log, and that log is really punky. It's just falling apart into sawdust, and that's a great substrate, and the cougars love to scrape on that. And in this case, they're using forest debris. So my theory about this is that the scent glands on their feet may leave more scent on something like that, the wood that's rotting away, because it's a little bit more spongy of a type of material, and it may hold scent better than just dirt. Because just dirt isn't going to have a lot of organic material in it. So if they make a scrape on a log or on vegetation, there's going to be a little bit more organic material that may hold the scent longer. And in that video, you also notice that the mountain lion was sniffing an older scrape area. And that older scrape was 3 months old at the time that it sniffed it, and it was still seemed to detect that there was some scent there. So it would be interesting if somebody would ever do a study about the types of substrate that they use and how long those scents last, if there's any way that humans can detect it with any instruments. So let's look at a few smaller animals and the kind of signs you can find from them. Little animals like rodents and rabbits. In this case, there's a little cottontail right down here, very well camouflaged, and they make these little paths to transition through the brush. So when a little cottontail lives in an area, they don't range over a long distance. They're prey animals, and they tend to stay more localized and not venture too far away from their home range. They pick one area, that's where they live, and they know that area very well, and they use it frequently over and over. And over time, they develop little paths through it. So they may keep those paths open by feeding on some of the grasses around them, cutting them down. As you can see, some of these here look like they've been cut off. And there's little pieces down here of blades of grass that are in various stages of drying, all around the entrance to this little tunnel system that the rabbits have here. And the same over here, there's a little run going up to this tunnel here that goes into the deeper brush. But all this area out here has open grass, and this is good stuff for feeding. All this stuff out here, this is a little feeding area. So when they sense danger, they run into that tunnel for shelter. And they don't dig burrows around here. We don't have any rabbit species that dig burrows, except for, I think, the pygmy rabbit is the only one in North America that does that. But none of our native species dig burrows. They actually rest in forms, and they create these little tunnels. The tunnels are mainly just to transit through the area safely and not have to come out into the open. Because if you're in the open and you're a rabbit, it's very easy for an owl or a hawk or something to swoop down and grab those little rabbits. Some of these cottontails only weigh a couple pounds, so they're very vulnerable to predation. And so when you're tracking these guys, you're mostly looking for signs like this, signs of their presence. Sometimes you can find scats in these little trails and in their tunnels that indicate the rabbits have been using that area. And you can also find the feeding signs like this, and places where they've clipped the tunnels to keep them open. So rabbits aren't the smallest animals that do that. I think one of the smaller animals that creates this kind of sign is the vole. And voles are very numerous. They're food for a lot of animals. Owls, hawks, weasels, bobcats, you name it. Pretty much everything out there eats voles. They're also called the meadow mouse. They're just little rodents with short little tails, and they create tunnels under the grass. So if you have an area that has tall grasses, native grasses growing, and you part the grasses and look down there, you can find these little tunnels. They're little round tunnels, and a lot of times there will be clippings of grass along those tunnels. You can see right here at the entrance to this one, there's some places where little bits of grass have been clipped back. And so that's because the vole is maintaining this opening so that it can get in and out of there quickly. And over time, they will develop these little pathways. And this one was exposed, which was kind of interesting. This was on a trail where there was vegetation over here and vegetation on this other side, but the center part right here in the middle of the trail, the vole had just made this tunnel going straight across. And I can imagine the vole just running straight across that exposed part to get to the more sheltered part that was underneath the vegetation there, because the longer they're in the open, the more vulnerable they are and they can get caught by a predator at any time. So I think that behavior is something that we see in this type of sign. You can sort of interpret that behavior from this because they don't want to be exposed. And so most of their activities are going to take place underneath this cover. Voles, their tunnels often will have scats in them. And voles are another one that actually uses their scats to mark things. So if something shows up in their tunnel, say a rock falls in there or something, that's a new object that they're not familiar with, they'll actually cover it with scats. They'll mark on it with scats. And so they will create latrines as well. Voles create latrines. They have little chambers in here that they'll make latrines in. If you're looking at this sign, it's super small. You have to get down on your hands and knees, look in these little tunnels and see the vole sign. The type of thing to look for with their feeding sign is the vegetation being clipped off at the ends with a very sharp angle, almost 45 degrees, not a perfect 45, but a really super sharp angle. And that's true of the rodents and the rabbits because they have those really sharp incisor teeth that they use to clip the vegetation with. So look for that angle on any of the vegetation that you expect or suspect was clipped by a vole. So let's talk about a little bit about feeding signs and how you can tell who made the feeding sign. So when deer crunch acorns up, they literally crunch them. They crush them with their teeth. Their teeth are more designed for crushing than they are for shearing. So animals with sharp teeth that are narrow and have sharp tips, like your canines and your felines, that kind of tooth is designed for cutting through meat. The animals that have the flat topped teeth, like deer, those teeth are designed more for grinding things. And so acorns and vegetation require a little bit of grinding. When deer feed on acorns, you can often detect the sort of, I don't know, I want to call it like a crenellated top to their tooth, the surface in some of these acorns. And you'll see just little peaks and valleys, little poke marks in there. But when they chew on things, they're grinding the shells and then they spit out the shells and they eat the nut itself. And so deer feeding sign on acorns is a little bit more messy than what we'll see with the rodents because deer are not, they're not using sharp teeth to cut out the acorns. They're actually just grinding the shells off and then swallowing the acorns. So this is what deer feeding sign looks like as opposed to, let's look at some rodents. So first I wanted to say one thing about the location. Rodents, like mice, being vulnerable like the voles, they tend to take their food underneath things. So this was mouse feeding sign. It's got a very neat hole in it. You can see, I think there's some more back here in this corner, but it was located underneath a log. I had to use a flash on the camera to get the picture because it was dark under there. So mice are vulnerable and they'll take their food underneath things to feed on it, as opposed to bigger critters, which we'll see in a moment. So when mice open acorns, remember we saw how neat that opening was. And sometimes you can actually see the little tooth marks in the shell. The one on the left here, this is an acorn. You can see the little tooth marks here on the edge. This one is a little bit of a harder shell. This is a hazelnut. And if you've ever cracked hazelnuts, you know how hard those shells are. You can see the little tooth marks, and you can see how tough it was for this mouse to get into that hazelnut shell, because over here, this is the shell from a different angle. And look at how much this mouse was trying to get in there. There's paired tooth marks all over this thing until it finally managed to open a hole in there and get to that nut meat. But it was very persistent. That took a lot of work for the mouse to get in there. Acorns have shells that are not as thick and not as tough. So when they open acorns, you'll see what we call chatter. And that's these little tooth marks right here. See these little marks? Little tiny marks just on the edge of these acorns. This is called chatter. And so what happens is the mouse chews open the shell, but when they're feeding on the nut that's in there, they plant with their lower incisors. They plant it, and then they scoop with their upper ones. So they're scooping that nut meat to get it out of there and eat it, because they can't take really big bites like other creatures, right? Because they're very small. So they have to scoop with their teeth to get this the nut. So that's feeding by mice. Very neat holes, and very different looking from what we saw with the deer. Now with squirrels tend to do a couple of things that are pretty recognizable. One is when they clip the branches. So these branches here were clipped off the tree. And if you were to pick these up and look at the ends of them, you'd see what looks like this. You'd see this sort of stair-step pattern. Notice how there's parallel marks here, because a squirrel can't just bite through an entire stick. It has to bite from the side and kind of clip, 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 clip until it falls off. So they basically gnaw on it until it falls off the tree. And so that's why you'll see this sort of stair-step pattern developing on limbs that these squirrels have cut off of trees. And once it's on the ground, they'll cut the cone off, and then they'll feed on the cone. And you'll see paired marks from their teeth on this cone. Or yeah, this is a Douglas fir cone, but you can see the fine tooth marks in there where it gnawed them off. And what they're doing is they're taking the cone scales off. So here's a mature acorn up here with cone scales. Underneath each cone scale are two paired seeds sitting there. And so as the squirrel goes through here, it chews off the cone scale, eats the two seeds, and discards the cone scale. And it does that repeatedly, and it just turns the cone in its paws, just like us eating corn on the cob. It turns that in its paws and slices off a cone scale, eats the seeds, throws them out. And eventually, when they're all done, they just discard this, which looks like a corn cob. And that's the feeding sign of squirrels. So the location with squirrels is a little, I have heard that, right or left-handed. I have heard that with the squirrels and the way that they turn the cones. I just noticed a question over there. I have read that, and I've noticed that they do it in a spiral pattern. So I'm not sure if that's really true, but I think it is. Okay, so squirrels, when they're feeding on things, rather than taking them to underneath a log like your mice do, a squirrel is a little bit more active. They can escape up a tree. And so they like to use platforms to feed on. So a stump is a great place to look for squirrel feeding sign. Look on the top of this stump, you'll see where a bunch of acorns have been opened up. And down here, you can see where not only acorns were open, but those cone scales are left from where a squirrel was feeding on one of these Douglas fir cones. Here's the cob right there. These are the little cobs. So those are stumps. Chipmunks and squirrels, like your gray squirrels, like to use perches. And then birds will also use these. Birds use them like an anvil. So what a bird does is it'll sit on the top of a stump, and it'll hold the acorn in one or two of its feet, and then it'll use its beak to bang on the acorn to open up the shell. So it's holding it still with its feet, and it's just banging on it. And it needs a hard surface to do that. So they use logs, they use stumps, rocks, things like that as an anvil, so that they can just have a harder surface underneath. And when they pound their beak on that nut to open up the shell. So that's what an anvil is from a bird's perspective. When a bird opens acorns, a lot of times you'll see that they're very roughly open. Sometimes you'll see little impact marks in the shell that's left behind. And it's messier than when squirrels do it because squirrels peel them. Okay, gray squirrels are what we call a scatter hoarder. So when they're going to store acorns, they store one acorn here, one acorn there, here, there, and everywhere, all throughout their territory. And they do a very similar thing when they're feeding on cones on the ground. They'll feed on a cone, drop it. Then they'll go grab another one, feed on the cone and drop it. So the gray squirrels, they're bigger. Gray squirrels, fox squirrels, they don't mind being on the ground as much as mice do because mice are much more vulnerable. Squirrels have an escape route nearby. They can run up a tree. And so they seem to be more bold in nature. They just seem to have a little bit more of a ability to take risks than mice. So squirrels tend to feed out in the open sometimes. And so that's another clue that will help you tell it was a squirrel, not a mouse. Pine squirrels, which include your red squirrel and the Douglas squirrel, which the little guy on the left is a Douglas squirrel, which is in my region. You guys have red squirrels, but they tend to be what we call larder hoarders. So a larder hoarder takes their stash of food and hides it in a big, it might be a hole, it might be a hollow in a tree. In this case, these are maple seeds that this little Douglas squirrel had been packing into this hole and just storing them in there and then feeding all around. So here's a scat right here where the squirrel has been feeding. There's a bunch of discarded open ones here and there. So this was a larder of a Douglas squirrel. Also red squirrels do this. So they have their strategy of storing food makes them a little bit more vulnerable. If another animal comes along and discovers their larder, they could lose a lot of their stored food at once because they put it all in one place. Whereas your scatter hoarders, like the gray squirrels, where they put here, there, and everywhere, they're not quite as vulnerable to losing their entire stash of nuts that they store for the winter because they've scattered it all over the place, and it's much less likely that an animal is going to stumble on all of those. So these little guys take a little bit more risk by being larder hoarders rather than scatter hoarders. When the red squirrel and Douglas squirrel feed on their stored food, they like to do it in a certain place. So they'll use one perch over and over and over for days, weeks, months, and you'll get a midden underneath it. And the midden is just the discarded signs of their feeding. So all these cone scales out here, the cobs that are left after they fed on the cones, they pile up, and sometimes you'll find big piles. If one of these has been used for generations, it could cover 15, 20 feet of forest floor, 3 feet deep easily, because some of these guys use them for generations. So midden is a characteristic of the feeding style of the little Douglas squirrel and the red squirrel. Another thing that those guys do that's really cool is this. They're not decorating their trees here. They're actually taking the mushrooms from the forest floor. They put them up in a tree and stick them in the branches and let them dry. And once those are dry, then they'll move them into a storage place. One of their little places like they hoard the nuts. They'll have a storage location. It could be a hollow in a tree. It could be a burrow dug in the ground. But once these mushrooms are dried out, they'll put them in there for storage for feeding on them later. So this is characteristic of the red squirrel and the Douglas squirrel to sort of decorate the trees with their mushrooms. So as we wind down here, I wanted to talk really briefly about the subnivean animals. When we have snow on the ground itself maintains a higher temperature than the surface of the snow will have, because the surface is, of course, exposed to the air and the wind and everything else. But that subnivean area, layer under the snow is still active with animals living under there throughout the winter. And what they do in there, these guys, pocket gophers, they dig, they make their burrows and things just like they would do normally, but they're doing it under the snow. And so when they remove soil, it has to go somewhere. So they push it back into a snow tunnel behind them to get rid of it, get it out of their way. And when the snow melts, you end up with these things on the surface, these funny looking little snaky things. And these are called eskers. This is the material that was moved throughout the winter by this little guy. And you can see how it's kind of ropey and on top of itself over here. And that's all the activity that pocket gopher was doing under the snow all winter in the subnivean area layer. They're still active down there. There's still food. They're still, making their lives. So the animals that do not hibernate are still active. Voles are active under the snow. And remember the voles with their little grass tunnels creating chambers for their scats. Well, they do the same thing under the snow. And so you end up with little latrines of scats that during the winter, the vole was placing in its little latrine chamber. And come the spring, all the snow melts off and you end up with this little cluster of scats, vole scats in a place where it kind of looks funny in the spring, but to the vole, there was an actual tunnel and a little chamber that they were using during all winter. Okay, so what we have talked about is all kinds of species interactions with scent. We've talked about feeding signs and things that animals do in mating season to leave scent for each other. And so I'm just gonna leave you with this last video here showing animals making scent markings. This is a family of mountain lions and one of them deposited a scat. And over time, other animals will come and look at this scat, they'll sniff it, and they will do a couple other things to it. A bear actually knocked the camera over, so that's why the angle changed like this. But the bobcat is actually looking at that mountain lion scat, although the apparent position has not changed. So notice how it's very interested in this. It's doing that open mouth posture, the phlegm response that cats have. Sometimes they'll mark on top of things or they'll mark nearby. Watch this. That backwards with the tail raised right there, it just sprayed urine on that little stump. So that was doing its own scent marking. This coyote is also interested in the same scat. And remember that behavior that our gray fox did called overmarking? Well, coyotes also do that. So from a tracking perspective, the thing that we would see here would be the mountain lion scat. Because these other animals are depositing urine, we wouldn't see that. But if they deposited a scat there, we would be able to see that. So some of these behaviors are beyond our ability to detect, but look right here, this coyote is depositing a scat. And mountain lions will develop what are called community scrapes, a site like this that they use repeatedly, sort of like the otters, where the otters were using the latrine as their post office. Mountain lions will develop community scrape areas too, where one lion will leave a scrape and another one will come by and leave a counter scrape, counter marking. So that's another way that they communicate. And we can see these scrapes, but we can't see the scent. So as a tracker, we are visual and we're looking for things that are detectable to our eyes only. All right. So does anybody have any questions? I'm just going to let this one play in the background. If you guys have questions. Oops.
Lots of questions. That was amazing, Dan.
All right.
Yeah, just love learning stuff. This is fascinating.
So many things, so many aspects to it.
Yeah, so lots of great questions. I'm going to start at the top and we can go.
Okay.
Are there specific bear trees, this is from Natasha, specific trees that bears leave claws and teeth marks, I guess more than others? I know up here they show up best on beech trees, but do they have preferences, I guess?
I think diameter makes a difference. They don't tend to, I mean, they'll beat up the smaller diameter saplings, But as far as like the marking trees and the climbing trees, those tend to be wider in diameter. In my area, they'll strip the bark. I mean, there's so many other bear signs that I couldn't get into, but they'll strip the bark, they'll peel the bark off redwood trees to feed on the cambium underneath. But I think diameter is the most important thing as far as that, because certain trees are too small for some of their behaviors. The little ones, they tend to break if they're going to do any of those destructive things. So I think diameter is the most important factor to look for.
All right. So next from Byron, are there any resources on distance between finger, claw mark signs on trees, as in to differentiate between raccoon, porcupine, gray squirrel, red squirrel, black bear, etc.?
I think what I would use for that, because a lot of times when animals are marking on trees, their claws are splayed. I would use a resource like a tracking guide that publishes a range of measurements. So Mark Elbrock's books on tracking cover North and South America pretty well, and he has ranges of measurements. So narrow versus splayed tracks. I think that would be one of the best resources to look.
All right. Great. Other than context, so oops, I can't see who's asking this. This video in the background is so distracting. It's amazing.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's a good distraction. Trust me.
Sorry.
Wow. I'm lucky if I get a squirrel on my trail cameras. I think we got a fox the other day. That was it. This
one was still hunting on the edge of a canyon. It was still hunting.
Wow.
Just watching for prey.
That's amazing. Okay, so sorry, where was I? Okay, so from from Chantel, other than context, is there a way to identify fur as bear fur?
Ooh,
maybe one of the
other than a microscope. Context is pretty much what I've been using for that. Is location on well-used bear trails, location on trees that they have rubbed on or otherwise been sign marking on, the height of the tree sometimes, because if they're rubbing their backs, a lot of times that sign is 6 feet up the tree, and there's not many other mammals that can reach that far up to leave fur. Elk can, but elk fur looks different. It's a when elk mark on trees, the sign looks different.
Okay.
I would use height, and other than that, just context.
Color, like around here, I think.
Color.
Because I don't think a skunk would get up that high, but
no.
an owl's dragging it up.
and the bear fur will fade too. The black bear's fur will fade as it gets exposed to sun. It'll fade to a light brown, like a blonde color.
Same with my hair, the roots are coming out really blonde. I call it Arctic blonde. So one from Bill. Interesting addition to share with Kim. A new study in the Journal of Zoology suggested that another reason bears rub, in addition to those mentioned, is when bears wiggle against bark, the tree scratching hosts leak out resins and saps. These substances stick to fur and skin and are water resistant, making them a strong contender for an effective tick repellent.
Oh, that's cool. Oh, I like that. I gotta read that study.
Yeah. Hey, Bill, do you want to send us the link?
Yeah, send us the link. I want to. Yeah, if you have that, that would be great.
That's great. Okay. If we get it, we'll share it with you, Kim.
Okay. Awesome.
All right. So Karen is saying, are the bears making territory, I guess, when they're rubbing up against the trees?
Yeah, they are in a way. Bears aren't as fiercely territorial as some other animals are. I mean, they will defend it against others of their species in a way. They'll run each other off, but as far as having battles to the death like some species do, the bears aren't really that fiercely territorial, but they are sensitive to other bears in their area. And depending upon which one is bigger or which one knows that it's the trespasser, they may have encounters. But I don't think it is in some ways a territorial thing. But there's that old adage about how high up a tree, the taller, the bigger the bear. The big tough guy, because he can mark taller up the tree. But that actually isn't that true, because they'll actually mark on lower down on the trees, which really isn't that impressive from a standpoint of trying to impress other bears with the height of his mark. Oh.
All right. So from KCB, how long do bears use the beds before moving on? One night, several nights, months?
They can use them. It depends, I think, on the availability of what's attracted them to the area. So what I'm finding where I live anyway is in the springtime, there's certain places that have foods at certain times of the year. And especially in the spring, they're a little bit less mobile. And they're wanting to stay near these food sources. And so they could use them for a month and then just move on and never use it again. Or they could use it a couple years in a row and then never use it again. So it varies. Bears have numerous beds throughout their territory. They may use one for one night and then move on.
Cool. All right.
Yeah.
So John and Sandy Churchill are asking, how can you tell that it's not a muskrat eating mound? So I guess that's comparing it to the beaver ones.
Oh, good question.
They're in
Yeah.
the same areas.
Yeah, I think where those two overlap, that would be really difficult. You'd have to rely on associated clues, I think, because the two of them both do those kind of behaviors. So you'd have to rely on associated clues like whether there's a dam nearby or whether there's a muskrat nest versus a beaver. I mean nest. Versus a beaver lodge versus a muskrat lodge. You'd have to have associated clues pretty much. It would be hard to tell them apart.
And I find in a lot of areas they overlap. There was one beaver dam and there was just beavers and muskrats plowing around one night.
Everywhere.
They were everywhere.
Yeah, that would make it challenging for sure.
Yeah. DNA analysis.
Yeah, DNA. Yeah, they have that environmental DNA now where they can take DNA samples from tracks. It's pretty cool.
Oh, really? Oh, cool.
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Great. So from Chantel, would you able to tell us just briefly what cyber tracking is?
Oh, cyber tracker. Okay. Cyber tracker originally began in South Africa as a way to certify some of the native trackers there, who are some of the best trackers in the world, but may not necessarily read and write English. So originally it was created as a software program that they could input data on the old Palm Pilot using an icon-based system. But there became a need to be able to certify the tracking skill level of the people that were submitting that data. And so Cyber Tracker was developed as a certification system for trackers for that purpose, so that tracking skill could be documented, and we would realize the reliability of the data that people were collecting in the parks in South Africa. And since then, it has spread as a certification system to pretty much all the continents. So there's a European cyber tracker, it's in Spain and in the USA. So it's a certification system where trackers are certified in track and sign identification and trailing. So there are two courses that you can take. They're interrelated, of course, but trailing would be following the animal. And that goes back to the origins in South Africa, where people are guiding tourists to see these animals, and they want to take them safely in to see the animal and then safely back out without the animal seeing them. So that's what the trailing part is.
It's just been added to my things to do list.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. If there's a cyber tracker certification in your area, well worth taking one of the evaluations, because it's a very amazing learning experience.
Oh, good. All right. So maybe I'll see some of the people from the audience at one.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right. So we have another one from C. Volp. We got lots of questions.
Okay.
And I think we've all been here. Why do raccoons poop on your back deck?
The raccoons, no, they
Yeah.
A lot of times, like what I found what they were doing is in this one neighborhood, they were pooping closest to the house that had the pet food outside for the pets that the raccoons were getting into at night, or the trash cans that they were able to get into at night. So if there's a nearby food source, a lot of times they'll develop a habit of pooping near that as a way, sort of, I guess, to market for other raccoons to be aware, this is my food source, my favorite trash can, get out of here. But I mean,
glad humans don't do that.
yeah.
So here's a fun fact. I don't know if you know this about City of Toronto. After they give birth, the density of
Mm.
raccoons can be 500 to 600 per square kilometer.
Oh yeah, easily. Yeah.
Like they're,
Yeah.
I think they have more there than anywhere in the world.
Oh
And they
yeah.
are big, and they
They are
really,
huge.
they open doors,
Urban.
they go help themselves, they show up for
Oh
dinner.
yeah. Yeah. Urban raccoons, they get huge and they get into everything. Those little hands just let them get into all kinds of things.
Yep.
Hard to keep them out of anything.
All right, so next one's from Jenny. This is fantastic information. I agree. Kim, thank you. Do you have any recommendations for where to learn about winter print identification tracking in snow or sand? So we do have one coming up with us if you're in the local area, but it's full, so waiting list. Any
Yeah,
other ones?
tracking in snow. There was a talk, a cyber tracker talk, a couple weeks ago. A guy up in Alaska did a tracking talk for us on tracking in snow and how that's different than other substrates, and it's probably up on YouTube now. Tracker Certification North America. I think they put it on YouTube. It may also be on their Facebook. I know they recorded it. Yeah, if there are any talks like that, I know the guy that did it was a biologist from Alaska, a super good tracker, and talked about tracking in snow. And that's a whole subject for another presentation all by itself, is snow tracking.
Yeah, well, that's, I think locally, at least, that's where you get the best tracks because
Yeah, that's where they're,
that's why
yeah, the same thing. Yeah, same thing here with sand, like in the desert areas, sand would be one of the better places for tracks. But some of the tracking books do have a lot of examples in snow. So if you look at Mark Elbrock's book, he does have a lot of snow examples. There is one, Field Guide to Tracking Animals in Snow by Louise something, I can't remember the name, the author. There's a Field Guide to Tracking Animals in Snow book. That's the ones I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay, and I know that the scripture is picking up. It's Mark Elbrock. It's ELBROCH.
Right.
Not
Yeah.
Elbrock, like it's spelled.
Right. Right.
And yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah.
Okay. And apparently someone, or just kind of catching a bit of the chat, that webinar you mentioned is online, and the link has been posted in the chat.
Oh, did they find it? Okay, good.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Oh, he had. Okay, somebody put it up. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So
excellent.
Alexis is asking, do flying squirrels exhibit any different feeding behaviors than gray or red?
Flying squirrels, like their diet can differ also because they'll eat fungus where I mean the gray squirrels will eat fungus too, and so will the red squirrels, but yeah. Flying squirrels have shelters in trees, and I'm not sure if they always take their food back to a sheltered place. So not really sure on the difference on those two. They're pretty rare in my area, although they are here. It's very rare to find signs of them. So not sure about specific differences between those.
So I did attend a webinar with someone who studied them because they're around here.
Yeah.
And 90% of their diet is fungi. And they will like dry it out, like the example that you used. So for people going out and harvesting mushrooms, remember you're taking it away from a really cute little flying squirrel.
Oh, yes, they are. They're so cute.
They are, yeah. I almost got hit in the head with one once. It flew by me.
Oh no.
Like, this would be the coolest injury. Anyways.
I got hit by a squirrel.
I know, flying one. All right. Okay, so Dom is asking, oh, this is a fun one. What animal leaves scat on rabbit remnants? So I guess
that might be a fox, because they mark on everything. Yeah, if you sit down on a bench the next day, a fox might mark on it where you sat. They just are prone to marking on everything, and they seem to be able to control how much scat they deposit each time. So when they deposit scat, it's not just because they have to go, it's because they're specifically marking things with their scat. So if there was a scat on top of a rabbit carcass, it sure might be one of the foxes.
Cool.
That would be my top suspect.
Yeah, we only have gray fox on Peely Island here. I think everywhere else it's red fox here.
Gray and red. Yeah, I
but
wouldn't,
keeps it
yeah,
easy.
there's not many predators that I would suspect of defecating on something like that, other than a fox.
Foxes are weird.
They're just weird. They're just,
Very odd.
they
Um,
are.
all right, so Seavolp is also asking for a session on identifying tracks in the snow, but I think we've provided some alternative, and maybe, hey, next year, fingers
Yeah,
crossed.
right? Yeah.
All right, we love game coming out. Do you have any book suggestions? This is from an anonymous person.
Book suggestions. I like Mark Elbrock's books because he's very thoroughly gone through and done. I mean, there's a second edition now of Mammal Tracks and Sign. There is a Bird Tracks and Sign book also, and that whole series has a reptile and amphibians track book. It has an insect track book. So that's probably the most thorough treatment so far is the Stackpole Books series that started with Mark Elbrock's books. And then Paul Resendez has a really good book, Tracking in the Art of Seeing, which is a really excellent one.
Got it right there behind me.
You have it. And then there's a Tracker's Field Guide by James Lowry, who also goes into good detail on the biology of the animals and tracking. He uses different terminology than Elbrock's book, so just be prepared that the gait descriptions will use different terminologies in his books. And then James Halfpenny has a series of books, regional books on tracks and tracking.
All right. Every time I look, there's more questions. Janet's asking, I hope you're okay to stay. Are you okay to stay, Kim?
Yeah, it's cool. It's cool. We're fine. Yeah, we're good.
So Janet's asking, squirrels seem to differentially choose certain acorns, eating some and discarding others. Are they looking for beetle larvae in the acorns or for more protein? Or do they discern the tannin levels as too astringent for their preference?
I've wondered about that as far as the tannin levels, whether they can tell if the tannin levels are too high. I do notice that they discard the ones sometimes with the holes from the beetle larvae in them. It seems like they won't open those, but that doesn't matter to a jay or a bird that's opening it. I don't think the birds mind as much, but the squirrels seem to discard a lot of those. Maybe they're not after the beetle larvae; they're more after the nuts than they are anything else. So they seem to just be like, oh, this one's got a hole, and they don't waste their time on it. They throw it aside. It's kind of rare to find those ones opened by the squirrels.
Would the
But
larvae
birds-
maybe rot it? Like if they've gotten in, it's not.
Usually the nut meat inside is not good. It's kind of rotted. Yeah, it's not edible from a squirrel standpoint. So I think they just discard those automatically. But birds have no problem because the birds eat the larvae. They just open it up and eat the larvae. So
Nice. It's all about balance, right? Everybody's got something to eat.
yeah, everybody has their favorite part of the acorn.
Yep. So Celine's asking saying that she's found a lot of sheds or bones where squirrel middens are. Is that coincidence or is there a reason for this? I know they chew on them. I guess it's deer sheds, but they decide to feed on cones in areas where other foods are found. So I think you're asking horse kind of thing for that.
I have noticed that, I mean, not so much the antler sheds, but I have noticed that smaller bones, squirrels can move those and they'll move them to their perches sometimes because they are gnawing on them for the calcium. And there have been a few times when I've actually moved them off the perch to see what would happen. And next time I walk by there, the squirrel had moved it back up on the perch. So they are specifically moving small bones around to their perches because they're gnawing on them for calcium. I'm not sure about antlers. I'm assuming if it's small enough antler that the squirrel could drag it to its regular feeding perch, but I haven't seen them do that with antlers. Definitely seen it with bones though.
Would they bring the middens to where the antler is that they found maybe?
I don't think they'd bring the midden, or maybe the antler's there and they just developed a midden there because they're gnawing on the antler too. And so they might as well feed on their cones at the same location, and just incidentally the midden begins to accumulate there. That would be one theory. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So this may be probably one of the better questions of the night. Thank you, Natasha. Do the animals always poop with a purpose?
Not always. I don't think. I mean, For bears, it seems to be pretty random. They don't seem to worry about where they do it. There've even been cases where I've seen bear scat strewn out over, many yards of a trail because the bear just pooped as it walked, and they're not worried about it. But a lot of the other animals are using their scat for scent purposes. So canines and felines often will mark at trail junctions or objects in the environment that will attract attention of others of their species. And the same thing with the otters. Mustelids, they'll tend to mark on top of rocks and things. Ringtails will do it. You guys don't have ringtails, but yeah, there are a lot of species that are actually using it for a purpose. And then there's some that just don't. Like squirrels drop it randomly, pretty much. Deer drop it randomly. Yeah, squirrels, deer, rabbits, they just tend to drop it randomly, and bears drop it randomly. But other ones like the carnivores seem to use it for a purpose a lot of the time.
I wonder if that's the digestive function, like carnivores versus grazers, that more of a constant eating production that you can't hold versus random diet, random food. So I just want to say I love that my job involves like a serious discussion on scat, and that's normal. I love it.
Grazers are just putting food in all the time. They have to intake so many calories that I don't think they worry about where it goes. But yeah, carnivores are a little different.
A good point. Carnivores would need to mark more than herbivores.
Yeah, herbivores don't have to mark. They don't want to be found. So I've even seen deer going into the river to urinate and defecate to hide their scent. I mean, they wade out into the water, do their business, and come back out. I mean, it seems my theory on that was that they're doing it to hide their scent, because I've seen them do it on multiple occasions. And I mean, I can't figure out why else they would do that other than to maybe obscure their scent somehow.
Makes sense.
Yeah, if you're a prey animal, you don't want everybody to know you're around.
That's very good, very neat.
Yeah.
Okay, so Jude's asking, and I'm not sure, do you sell wonderful B&W rules? Could I find it on your website?
The rulers, yes, those are on my website. Yeah, the rulers are free on my website. If you want a ruler that you can print and cut out, they are on the Bear Tracker website under rulers. There's two different styles. You can print out a 6-inch or 10 centimeters, and then there's a 3-inch, and I forget how many centimeters that is, but that are on the website there that you can print. If you go to bear-tracker.com and then just scroll down till you see the free printable rulers, or do a keyword search for rulers and you'll find it. There's a page with links to both of them there.
Great.
Maybe somebody could find that link and put it in the chat.
Yep, Serena, I'll do that to you and I'll manage the questions.
Yeah.
Oh, here's a fun one, like someone anonymous. Ever have a surprising experience while tracking or trailing?
Oh my goodness, yes. Yeah, one time I actually was coming up this trail, and I was coming up this old dirt road that has been abandoned for years, and I came up a rise, and there's a mountain lion coming down the other side straight towards me, and it saw me, and yeah, at the same time as I saw it, and I started to raise the camera, and it just turned tail and ran off, and yeah, I got a picture of its blurry form running away. So yeah, and then I've had a bear come up while I was taking a break on a bridge over a creek. I was eating my lunch, and a bear came up to see what I was doing. It didn't know what I was, and there was this alarm call from a jay over in the forest, and I looked over, and sure enough, there's a bear at the end of the bridge looking at me, and as soon as I moved, it took off running. So yeah, there have been a few fun encounters out there.
Nice. Great. So Torin is asking tips on how to tell the difference between an adult male bobcat track and a mountain lion kitten track. Their size, I guess, would overlap.
Ooh, that's a good one. Well, usually a kitten's going to be, and this is kind of tough because a kitten's usually going to be with a parent, although they can wander when they get teenage size. They can definitely wander off on their own. So bobcats, to me, it seems like the pads of the mature animals are flatter than those of the cougars, and that's just a generalization. It's not like written in stone or anything, but cougars have these really big fat pads, but they have a very distinct lobe in the center. and it shows up very frequently. A lot of times when you're following cougars on a dirt trail or just dust, the three lobing on the trailing edge of their pad will be the most prominent thing you'll see. And sometimes it's the only thing that shows up with that track because of the way they hit the ground with the heel part first. Bobcats, they also have that, but their tracks seem to be a little more flat, like that lobe. So if you're looking at the track as a flat surface, the lobe of the cougar track in the middle will dip down a little bit, whereas the bobcat is more of a flat bottom track to me. And that's just that's not something that's been written in any book or anything. It's just kind of an impression that I get from seeing their tracks. That the cougar, you could see that lobe a little bit more distinctly, but yeah, that's a tough one. That's like the difference between a large weasel and a mink. Those ones, yeah, they overlap in size too, and they're difficult.
Wow. I'd love to be able to have to figure out if it's bobcat or cougar, but that's very
I know. That'd be awesome, huh?
Yeah. I haven't seen, well, I think once I found cougar tracks, but it's probably an escape me because there was one in the area. All right, so Celine says, I've heard cats avoid using roads, so you won't often find their scat on one. Is this true for game trails?
Yeah, that seems to be true. Also, one thing that I noticed, just in following mountain lion trails on dirt roads, they tend to stick to one side of the road or the other. They like that instead of crossing the road where it curves. And animals do tend to like trails and dirt roads, things like that, because they're more open rather than fighting their way through brush. A lot of times if they're just traveling, they'll pick roads like that. If they're hunting, they'll be in the brush because they want to be more stealthy and hidden. But if they're just traveling around, wanting to get from one watershed to another, it's not uncommon for them to use trails and roads. So you definitely will find that, and you will find those scent markings on roads also. So edges of roads and intersections of roads and trails are places to look for canine and feline scent marks because they like to mark intersections.
And around our urban coyotes, you can see them as they cross at the pedestrian crossways. They've learned to cross them. Actually, watch one cross 6 lanes on the light. Wait, and then.
Oh my gosh!
I don't know if that counts.
Oh goodness! Yep.
Excuse me. So Lynn is asking, is there a difference between mice and squirrel teeth marks on acorns other than size?
Size wise, okay, so the tooth marks don't on squirrels, usually you can detect a tiny little space between them because their teeth are a little bit bigger. And usually when I find their marks on the outsides of acorns, I can tell that it's 2 distinct teeth. Whereas mice, it's a little harder because they have smaller teeth. But yeah, you would have to measure the width of the incisor mark if you had both of them because they have 2, right? If you measured the width of those and then consult I think Elbrock has that. I don't know if he has rodent incisors, but there is a table in one of his books where he has the distance between the canine teeth on predators, and I'm not sure about the smaller critters, but that's something that we might have to develop data on. Or it's just a general impression that when squirrels are opening acorns, they're not opening them as neatly as the mice are. So the mice make those little round holes, surrounded by the chatter, and the squirrels tend to peel the things off the acorn. They peel the shells off, so you'll find them in strips sometimes. So it's just a different strategy.
Great. So we're on 9 o'clock. I'm just going to I guess answer one more question. I'll just take the top one. Is there, of course, it's 2 questions in one. Is there any way to tell the difference between elk and deer scrape and bedding in areas where they share habitat? And then would a mountain lion still scrape in the snow?
Elk and deer, well, the elk are going to do the same thing as the white-tailed deer where they're going to make the scrape, they'll urinate in it. Sometimes they'll even wallow in it. So size-wise might make a difference because elk are much larger animals. I would just rely on associated clues. If you can find any tracks on the edge of it or anything like that to confirm, because that's going to take a little bit of investigation in the field to tell which animal left that one. kind of hard to make a generalization on that one. Although elk tend to make a muddy mess sometimes in theirs. When I used to work at the Grand Canyon and found elk wallows like that, they were pretty messy looking. And mountain lions, they will scrape on pretty much all kinds of surfaces, so they shouldn't have a problem with scraping on snow and leaving scent marks there. Although I don't think that's going to last very long. So I think that behavior is sort of ingrained in cats to do that scraping thing. I think that's just a behavior that they do, and it may not be substrate dependent, but I think that the substrates that they're choosing on the dry ground definitely seem to have more tendency to hold scent because they tend to be like that rotting wood substrate. So yeah, whether or not they do it on snow, that's a good question. And I don't have a definitive answer on that, but I think they would, yeah.
All right. So all those questions, and there's still like 18 left. So thank you everybody for your fantastic questions. We're going to wrap it up there. There's Kim mentioned some fabulous resources where I just took a quick look through the Q&A. I think a lot of the answers could be there. If you have any questions for us, our email is landtrust@oakridgesmoraine.org, and you will have had our contact information from the information to come to this webinar. And then here's some great links, which we will share with the, we'll send out a follow-up email and share some of the stuff we discussed today, as well as these links.
Oh, if anybody wanted information on the raccoon roundworm, if you go to the CDC website, you can get this. There's also pictures of the eggs and things, and photographs if you need to look at them. But if you are going to clean up a raccoon latrine, definitely check into the raccoon roundworm before you do it. But here, this is available on the CDC website. You can always download this there if you need more information about that. Don't try to clean up raccoon scats without protection.
Yeah, it's a dangerous one. All right, well, Kim, thank you so much. There's tons of applause and comments, and thank you, because that was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I hope you have a fantastic rest of your night. And I look forward to learning more from you, hopefully in the future.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for being here, and big kudos for being here. Thanks so much. Thank you for having me, and hope to see you on the internet in some of the tracking groups. If you find tracks you have questions about, we'll try to identify them for you there.
Or maybe we'll get you up to Canada for some snow tracking.
Oh, that would be so fun.
Yeah, you're always welcome.
That would be fun. Yes, absolutely.
All right, we'll work on that for sure.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Kim. Take care.
Thank you. All right, thank you.
Everyone, thank you for coming out.